June 6, 1944. From a concrete observation post high above Omaha Beach, a German officer watches through his field glasses. The defense is working exactly as planned. The pre-invasion naval bombardment was harmless. The American landing craft are being systematically destroyed by perfectly aimed artillery and machine gun fire. The first wave is trapped at the water's edge, shattered. For the defenders, it's a methodical, almost technical victory. But then he sees something that makes no sense. Small, isolated groups of soldiers, with no officers visible, begin to crawl forward. They should be broken. They should be surrendering. Instead, they are still coming. By 7:30 a.m., the American plan for Omaha Beach was in ruins. Command structures had collapsed. Radio contact was lost. In little over an hour, more than 2,000 men were dead or wounded, trapped on a narrow strip of sand. According to the doctrines of modern warfare, the assault was defeated, and yet it wasn't. This is the story of how a catastrophic failure transformed into a victory. The question is not simply what happened, but how. How did scattered, leaderless groups of men, pinned down in a 5-mile-long kill zone, find a way to stand up, advance, and break one of the strongest defensive lines in Europe? To understand how they escaped the trap, we must first see just how perfectly it was designed. The American plan for Omaha was a product of meticulous, industrial-scale military logic. It was a synchronized assault designed to overwhelm a known, static enemy. But it was built on 3 critical assumptions. All 3 would prove to be wrong. The first failure came from the air. At dawn, over 400 B-24 Liberators from the U.S. 8th Air Force were scheduled to saturate the German beach defenses with more than 1,200 tons of high explosives. For 30 minutes, they were to turn the bluffs into a cratered moonscape. But a thick layer of low-lying cloud obscured the coast. Worried about hitting their own invasion fleet, the lead bombardiers made a fatal, last-second decision. They delayed their bomb release by just 30 seconds. The entire payload overshot the beach, falling harmlessly up to 3 miles inland. The German strongpoints, the machine gun nests and artillery bunkers, were completely untouched. The first pillar of the plan had vanished into the clouds. The second failure came from the sea. The infantry were not supposed to land alone. They were to be led by a secret weapon, 64 Amphibious Duplex Drive, or DD, tanks. These Sherman tanks, fitted with canvas flotation screens, were designed to swim ashore and provide immediate, direct fire support. But the waves on D-Day were twice as high as forecast. In the sector of the 741st Tank Battalion, the decision was made to launch the tanks nearly 3 miles from shore. The canvas screens, designed for calm water, were swamped by the churning sea. One by one, 27 of the 29 tanks filled with water and sank, taking their crews with them. The infantry would now face the German machine guns without armor. The third and most critical failure was one of intelligence. Allied planners believed Omaha was defended by a single, low-quality regiment of the 716th Static Infantry Division, older men and foreign conscripts, but they were wrong. Just weeks before, the German command had reinforced the sector, moving in the battle-hardened, full-strength 352nd Infantry Division. And in a moment of terrible irony, on the morning of June 6th, the 352nd was conducting a full-scale anti-invasion drill. The Americans were not just landing against a stronger enemy, they were landing in the middle of a dress rehearsal for their own destruction. Instead of a weakened defense, they faced double the number of machine guns, expertly positioned in concrete bunkers called Widerstandsnester, resistance nests, all with interlocking fields of fire designed to sweep every inch of the beach. For the men of the first wave, the situation was hopeless. The plan was gone. The support was gone. Pinned down at the water's edge, with the tide rising behind them and an unbreakable wall of fire in front, the assault had stalled. The battle for Omaha Beach was, for all practical purposes, already lost. The stalemate was absolute. But then, on the sector known as Easy Red, the paralysis was broken, not by a general's order, but by a tool. Amidst the chaos, a small team of combat engineers from the 5th Engineer Special Brigade began crawling toward the shingle, a steep, 15-foot-high bank of stones that formed an impassable wall. Their mission was to clear a path. Under constant grazing fire, they assembled a Bangalore torpedo, a long steel pipe packed with TNT. It was a high-stakes gamble. The engineers were completely exposed. A single stray bullet hitting the charge would vaporize them and everyone nearby. With numb fingers, they pushed the completed torpedo under the thick concertina wire. wedging it against the base of the stone embankment. They took cover. The detonation was a vicious, localized eruption. It didn't create a highway. It blasted a single, narrow, smoking gap through the wire and shingle. This was not one of the official designated exits. Those were still perfectly zeroed in by German machine guns. This was something else, an improvised, ugly tear in the Atlantic wall. But it was an opening. For the first time that morning, a handful of men had a way off the killing floor of the beach. That small breach was not a strategic breakthrough. It changed nothing on the grand map. But for the men huddled nearby, it was a signal. It was tangible proof that the fortress could be broken, an invitation to advance. For the men of the 16th Infantry Regiment huddled behind the shingle, that raw gap was a choice: stay and die on the beach, or move into the unknown. Their officers were gone. Company command structures had dissolved. They were no longer soldiers in a unit, but survivors in a crowd. Then, a voice cut through the noise. A sergeant, or maybe a corporal, his name lost to history, made a decision. He didn't wait for an order from a phantom command post. He pointed to the gap. "To the sea wall!" It was a desperate, almost suicidal suggestion. They went, not in a wave, but one by one. Crawling over the bodies of their comrades, they fed themselves into the narrow opening. Beyond the wire, the real test began. A steep, grassy bluff, 170 feet high. It was a slope the Germans considered impassable under fire. The men used the terrain itself as their only ally. They scrambled from one shell crater to the next, using folds in the earth for cover, moving in the blind spots between the German concrete strongpoints. They were not attacking the bunkers. They were ghosts, slipping through the seams of the defense. Inside Widerstandsnest 72, the German gunners were still methodically sweeping the beach below. From their perspective, the battle was going according to plan. The American assault was contained, pinned down. But then, a confusing report came over a field telephone, a voice from a neighboring observation post, agitated and uncertain. He claimed to see Americans on the high ground, on their flank. The report was questioned, then dismissed. How could it be possible? The designated draws, the natural ravines leading up the bluff, were perfectly covered by machine gun fire. No one could have survived an ascent there. The main American force was still trapped at the water's edge. These sightings had to be mistakes. Panic, the fog of war. The gunners returned to their work, confident in the integrity of their fortress. But the first breach was not an isolated incident. All along the 5 miles of Omaha Beach, the same desperate calculus was leading to the same conclusion. In other sectors, leaderless groups of engineers and infantry were blowing more gaps in the wire with their own scavenged explosives. On Dog Green, men from the 116th Infantry Regiment, a unit that had been virtually destroyed in the opening minutes, began to coalesce around the few surviving non-commissioned officers. These were not organized counterattacks. They were groups of 5, 10, maybe 20 men from different companies, even different battalions, forming ad hoc fire teams. They had only one universal order left, unspoken but understood by all: get off the beach. And they followed the first man brave enough to show them a way. The confusing reports reaching the German command posts now became a flood. The single, panicked phone call turned into a dozen. Rifle fire was coming from directions it shouldn't be, from above, from the rear. A grenade, thrown by an unseen hand, dropped into a trench connecting 2 bunkers. The German system, a masterpiece of interlocking frontal defense, was being unpicked from the inside. At his headquarters several miles inland, the commander of the 352nd Division, General Dietrich Kreis, struggled to understand what was happening. His maps showed a solid defensive line, but the reports spoke of numerous small penetrations, not a breakthrough, not a collapse, something more insidious. The battle was no longer a neat diagram of fire sectors. It was a chaotic, multi-directional fight against an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. These leaderless American groups were effective because of the simple tools they carried. The standard issue M1 Garand rifle gave them a crucial advantage. Its semi-automatic 8-round clip provided a volume of fire that a German squad, armed primarily with bolt-action Kar 98K rifles, could not match in a close-quarters fight. Small teams of GIs could suppress a German machine gun position long enough for another team to move. They used their own grenades, and the terrain itself became their most important weapon. They moved through the dead ground, the small depressions and reverse slopes that were invisible from the concrete bunkers. They weren't fighting a conventional battle. They were fighting a guerrilla war on the bluffs of Normandy. These isolated infiltrations were bleeding the German defense, causing chaos and confusion, but they could not deliver a killing blow. They were still just disparate bands of survivors, cut off from each other, with no radios, no heavy weapons, and no central command. They had cracked the Atlantic wall, but they hadn't broken it. To win the beach, they had to become an army again. The German officers observing this chaos from their bunkers could not comprehend what they were seeing. In their military doctrine, a unit that lost its officers and communications was effectively neutralized. It was a broken piece of the machine. They saw only suicidal, random acts of desperation. They were wrong. What they were witnessing was the core philosophy of the U.S. Army's infantry doctrine, tested in the most extreme conditions imaginable. American non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals, were trained not just to execute orders, but to understand the commander's intent. The mission's ultimate objective was everything. If the plan failed, if the lieutenant was killed, if the radio went silent, it was the NCO's duty to take initiative, assess the new reality, and find another way to accomplish the original goal. This wasn't chaos. It was a system of decentralized resilience, designed to function even after being decapitated. The scattered groups moving up the bluffs weren't leaderless. They were being led by the first man to stand up, a corporal with a new plan. This doctrine got them to the high ground, but doctrine alone doesn't win battles. This raw, scattered initiative now had to be forged back into a weapon. By late morning, the critical mass was reached. On the shingle below the Easy Red sector, Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment stood among the survivors. His assessment was brutal and clear. He announced to the men huddled around him, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." His words were a shock of cold reality, but leadership was no longer just a voice, it was a physical presence. Soon after, another officer arrived on that same stretch of sand, Brigadier General Norman Cota, a general on foot in the thick of the fighting. He was a walking command post. Cota moved along the seawall, finding shell-shocked men, leaderless and pinned down. He didn't issue complex orders, he gave them a direction and a purpose. Spotting a group of rangers, he famously designated them the tip of the spear. "Rangers, lead the way." This was the turning point. Cota and Taylor began to personally organize the flow of men toward a recently cleared path up the bluff. It was no longer a desperate scramble for survival. It was a directed movement. Men were now being channeled up the slope with a specific mission: get on the flank of the German strongpoints. The small, infiltrating groups that had been fighting in isolation now began to link up on the high ground. For the first time, they had the numbers and the coordination to systematically attack the German bunkers from the rear. The battle for Omaha turned from a desperate fight for the beach into a deliberate assault on the fortress. One by one, the German guns that had created the killing zone were finally being silenced by the very men they had tried to annihilate. The German officer in his bunker was watching more than a battle. He was witnessing a fundamentally different theory of war. His own military system was a finely tuned machine built on structure and obedience. A unit that lost its officers was a broken gear, useless. It was expected to stop. But the men rising from the smoke on the bluffs were not a broken machine. They were the product of a system designed to function in chaos, a system that empowered its lowest ranks to take command, to improvise, to complete the mission when the plan had disintegrated. The victory at Omaha, then, was not the triumph of a superior plan. It was the triumph of a superior system for dealing with failure. It revealed a hard truth of modern warfare, that institutional resilience and the trained initiative of the individual can ultimately be more powerful than any strategy. The American plan was a disaster, and in the end, that is the most important part of the story. On D-Day, the American plan for Omaha Beach was a product of industrial logic, a rigid sequence of events that was supposed to unfold like clockwork. It failed completely, and that is precisely why the Americans won. The plan's collapse forced the emergence of something far more resilient, a victory built not on paper, but on people.